The sky above Car 17 burned red as the first wave of Zorsk Dominion dropships descended. Their hulls, black as voidstone, cast shadows over the jagged mountains and dense forests below. To the untrained eye, the invasion seemed effortless, unstoppable. The Dominion had done this 100 times before. They crushed civilizations with sheer numbers and superior firepower. But this time, they had chosen the wrong enemy. Commander Elias Voss stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, binoculars pressed to his face. His uniform, once pristine, was smeared with dust and sweat. He exhaled slowly, forcing down the tension curling in his gut. The Zorsk believed Car 17 would fall within a day. They had no idea what they had walked into. "Contact in 30 seconds, came Lieutenant Darrow's voice through the calm. 3 divisions, heavy armor. Elias lowered the binoculars. The enemy had committed a massive force to this first push. Overkill, by their logic. He could almost hear their arrogance in the formation, tight, predictable, unguarded at the flanks. They thought no one would dare challenge them head-on. A bitter smile crossed his lips. "They have no idea," he murmured. Darrow chuckled. "Ready when you are, sir." Elias tapped his earpiece. "Let them come." The Zorsk infantry landed first, their massive exoskeletal forms moving with mechanical precision. 8 feet tall, clad in segmented armor, they swept forward in coordinated lines, plasma rifles humming. Behind them, towering quadrupedal war mechs stomped into formation, scanning the terrain with cold, unfeeling optics. From their vantage point, Elias and his team watched in silence. The enemy was searching, expecting resistance in the open fields. They found nothing but abandoned outposts, shattered barricades, decoys set up to look like a retreat. A Zorsk officer raised a clawed fist, signaling his troops to spread out. Their leader, no doubt expecting an ambush, but only in the obvious places. That was their first mistake. Elias waited. Closer. The front line stepped past the old comms relay station. The war mechs followed, moving deeper into the choke point between 2 rock formations. Now. A thunderous explosion split the air. The valley floor erupted as buried charges detonated in a perfectly timed sequence. The first wave of infantry vanished in a maelstrom of fire and debris. Shrapnel tore through armor, cutting down the front lines before they had a chance to react. The war mech staggered, their massive frames rocked by the shockwave. Then the real attack began. From concealed bunkers and hidden foxholes, human soldiers emerged like ghosts. Railgun turrets powered up, unleashing hypervelocity slugs that punched through Zorsk armor as if it were paper. Snipers, camouflaged among the cliffs, picked off officers with pinpoint precision. Drones, hacked and repurposed from Dominion tech, descended like mechanical wasps, sowing chaos in their ranks. The enemy hesitated. They had never encountered such an immediate, coordinated counterattack. To them, this was supposed to be a simple invasion. Instead, they had walked into a carefully prepared execution. A Zorsk officer barked a command in their guttural tongue. The war mechs recovered, adjusting their formations. Plasma cannons whined as they locked onto human positions. A moment later they fired, blue-hot energy bolts slamming into the mountainside, vaporizing entire sections of rock. The earth shook as bunkers collapsed under the onslaught. Elias gritted his teeth. The Zorsk were adapting quickly. They always did. That was why this war wasn't about sheer strength, it was about being smarter, faster. He switched comm channels. "Team Theta, take out those mechs." A response crackled through. "On it." Moments later, a new volley of missiles streaked from the tree-line, weaving through the air before slamming into the war machines. Their shields flickered, failing under the sustained assault. The largest of them, a command variant, lurched forward, one of its legs severed in the blast. It crashed down, its own mass crushing the infantry behind it. The enemy lines faltered. Elias saw it. The hesitation. The creeping realization that they were losing control. That was when humans were at their most dangerous, not when they were fighting for victory, but when they smelled fear. Darrow's voice came through again. "They're pulling back. You want us to push?" Elias watched as the remaining Zorsk troops regrouped, staggering toward the wreckage of their drop ships. He considered it. A full counterattack would break them completely. But this wasn't about wiping out a single wave. It was about something bigger. Negative, he said. Let them run. Darrow hesitated. You sure? Elias smiled. I want them to tell their commanders what happened here. On the battlefield below, a lone Zorsk officer lay pinned beneath a fallen mech, his breathing ragged. He turned his head just enough to see a human soldier standing over him. His mandibles clicked in pain and frustration. The soldier knelt, voice low and almost pitying. You should have listened to your general. The Zorsk wheezed, his black eyes narrowing. The human leaned in closer, voice barely above a whisper. Pray we show mercy. Zaltorix stood motionless on the bridge of his command ship, watching the battlefield through a massive display. Kars 17, a backwater colony, should have fallen within hours. Instead, the first wave had been decimated. He had warned his superiors. He had studied humanity's wars, their history. The Dominion called them fragile, short-lived, reckless. He called them something else. Monsters of necessity. A junior officer approached, his armored frame stiff with unease. General, the 1st Division is in retreat. Casualties. He hesitated, mandibles clicking. 73%. Zaltorix's jaw tightened. That was not a battle. That was a slaughter. Second wave status? He asked. Awaiting deployment, sir. He exhaled slowly. A full second wave would be the obvious choice. Overwhelm the enemy, drown them in numbers before they could regroup. It was the same strategy the Dominion had used for centuries. And yet, deep in his core, he knew that with humans, obvious choices led to disaster. Hold them back. The officer hesitated. Sir? Zaltoric turned, his golden eyes sharp. The humans knew we would attack this way. They were waiting for it. If we repeat the same mistake, we hand them another victory. The officer swallowed hard but nodded. Zaltoric looked back at the screen. The human commander, Elias Voss. He had studied the reports. Special Forces background, adaptable, relentless. A man who knew how to win against impossible odds. He tapped a control on his gauntlet. Send a probe. I want eyes on them. Night fell over Kars 17, but there was no rest. Fires still smoldered where Dominion drop ships had been turned into scrap metal. Bodies lay in the fields, Zorsk and human alike. Somewhere in the darkness, a wounded alien soldier groaned, his voice lost in the wind. Elias sat on an overturned supply crate, field knife in hand, scraping dried mud from his gloves. His men moved quietly around him, reinforcing barricades, restocking ammunition, resetting traps. The real battle hadn't even started. Darrow crouched beside him, pulling a ration bar from his pack. They're waiting. Elias didn't look up. I know. They won't make the same mistake twice. They don't have to. Elias ran a finger along the edge of his blade. They just have to believe we're winning. Darrow frowned. Aren't we? Elias smirked. For now. The Zorsk scout drone skimmed low over the battlefield, its silent thrusters barely disturbing the air. It drifted through the ruins of the forward outpost, scanning for movement. At first, there was nothing. No heat signatures. No radio signals. Just bodies. Then movement. A lone human soldier, limping. Wounded, rifle slung over his back, he stumbled toward a half-destroyed bunker. The drone followed, adjusting its trajectory. It zoomed in, sensors locking on. Target acquired. The soldier collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. His helmet was missing, his face bloodied. He fumbled for a comm device, weak fingers struggling to activate it. The drone's targeting systems engaged. Then the ground beneath it opened up. A blast of electromagnetic energy surged through the air, frying the drone's circuits before it could react. It dropped, crashing into the dirt. Sparks flickered along its frame as a second soldier, hidden beneath camouflage netting, rose from his position. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and approached the fallen machine. He tapped his comm. Package secured. The wounded soldier stood up, wiping fake blood from his face. They took the bait. Zaltorix stared at the disrupted signal on his display. The feed had cut out abruptly. An EMP trap, the junior officer murmured. The general said nothing. He had expected humans to fight back, but this was something more. They weren't just resisting. They were leading the Zorsk by the nose. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Deploy the second wave. Sir, you said. Do it. But stagger the approach. No direct lines. No predictable formations. The officer hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Elias crouched in the shadows of a collapsed building, fingers resting on his rifle's trigger. The moment was coming. The Zorsk wouldn't stay idle after losing their drone. They would strike, and when they did, he needed to be ready. Through his visor, he watched the valley. The silence stretched. Then movement. Shadows shifting against the moonlit terrain. The second wave had arrived, but they were smarter this time. No tight formations. No easy traps. Elias exhaled slowly. Good. He needed them to take this seriously. Hold positions, he murmured into his calm. Darrow's voice came through. They're spreading out. We won't get another kill box like before. Doesn't matter. The first of the Zorsk soldiers moved through the wreckage, scanning for threats. Their weapons hummed, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. They were cautious now. Wary. The advantage was shifting. But Elias had one more trick left. He tapped his wrist console, activating the preset command. Across the battlefield, hidden speakers crackled to life. A deep, human voice echoed through the valley, distorted and inhuman. Asterisk, you should have left. Asterisk. The Zorsk hesitated. Their formation faltered. Asterisk, you should have listened to your general. Asterisk. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. A psychological weapon. Uncertainty spread like a virus. Then the real attack began. Explosions erupted from hidden charges, splitting the advancing forces. Snipers picked off high-ranking officers. Automated turrets, disguised as debris, tore through infantry. The Zorsk, despite their numbers, found themselves outmaneuvered. Elias stepped out of the rubble, rifle raised. He put 2 rounds into a Zorsk warrior before the alien even saw him. His men followed, emerging like wraiths from the darkness. The Zorsk tried to fight back, but it wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. And when it was over, when the bodies lay still and the silence returned, Elias turned his gaze to the sky. He knew Zaltorix was watching. And he knew the message had been sent. Zaltorix's claws tapped against the metal railing as he watched the battlefield from orbit. The screen before him showed the aftermath, his soldiers lying broken among the wreckage. It was the same story as before. His forces, larger and stronger, should have overrun the humans with ease. Instead, they had been outmaneuvered. Played. A soft chime signaled an incoming transmission. He turned, his golden eyes narrowing as the display flickered to life. High Warlord Kraxith loomed on the screen, his broad, armored form barely fitting within the frame. His mandibles curled in displeasure. Zaltorix, explain yourself? He straightened. The humans are not as weak as our intelligence suggested. Kraxith let out a sharp, guttural hiss. They are primitives. Their empire is a fraction of ours. They are survivors, Zaltorix corrected. And survivors fight differently. The High Warlord's gaze darkened. You requested full command over this invasion. The Dominion has invested resources, fleets, warriors. And you tell me we are failing? Zaltorix's fists clenched. He despised dealing with the Council. They saw war as numbers on a report, victories measured only by territory claimed. They did not see the battlefield, feel the weight of each miscalculation. I tell you that underestimating them will cost us far more than we can afford. Kraxith's mandibles twitched. Then finish this. I want Car 17 under Dominion control by the next cycle. The transmission cut out. Zaltoric turned back to the screen. Below, the human forces were already repositioning, reinforcing their hold. He exhaled, long and slow. There was only one way forward. Elias Voss stood at the edge of the outpost, watching the distant glow of burning wreckage. The battle had been another victory, but he knew better than to celebrate. This wasn't over. Darrow approached, helmet under one arm. They'll be back. Elias nodded. And soon. They won't fall for the same tricks again. I don't need them to. Elias looked at the horizon, where the first traces of dawn painted the sky in pale gold. I just need them to hesitate. Darrow's brow furrowed. You think they're scared? No. Elias turned, his expression unreadable. But their leader is starting to understand. Zaltoric's forces did not attack immediately. Instead, they moved with precision, shifting into positions that forced the humans to stretch their defenses. It was no longer a frontal assault, it was a slow tightening of the noose. Elias watched from his command center, reading the enemy's patterns. This was different. Calculated. He tapped his earpiece. Darrow. Here. They're changing tactics. No more brute force. They're adapting. A pause. Then, what's the move? Elias exhaled, eyes narrowing. We push first. Night fell, and with it came the first strike. A squad of human operatives slipped past enemy patrols, planting charges along key supply routes. Explosions tore through Zorsk encampments, cutting off reinforcements before they could mobilize. The Zorsk retaliated immediately, deploying hunter-killer squads to track the saboteurs. But the humans had already vanished, leaving only destruction in their wake. Zaltoric studied the reports, his mind racing. This was no longer a defensive war. The humans had seized the momentum. He had to break them before they broke him. He turned to his officer. Ready the shock troopers. We end this now. The first sign of the final assault was silence. The battlefield, once filled with the constant hum of distant skirmishes, fell into an eerie stillness. No movements. No signals. Elias knew better than to trust it. He raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. They're coming. Then the storm broke. Zorsk's shock troopers poured into the valley, their massive forms moving with terrifying speed. Unlike the first waves, these were elite warriors, trained for siege breaking. Their weapons unleashed pulses of energy that tore through human defenses, their sheer force driving soldiers back. Elias ducked behind cover as a blast sheared off the edge of a barricade. He tapped his calm. Darrow, tell me you're in position. A crackle. Then, say the word. Elias glanced at the advancing forces. They had committed everything to this push. This was their last gamble. He smiled. Now. Hidden turrets erupted to life, spewing streams of plasma fire into the advancing Zorsk. Explosives buried beneath the ground detonated in a controlled sequence, collapsing key paths and funneling enemy troops into kill zones. The battle became chaos. Elias moved through the wreckage, his rifle snapping off precise shots. The Zorsk fought with desperation, their warriors refusing to fall back. For them, retreat was no longer an option. In the heart of the battlefield, a towering figure emerged. Zaltoric himself. Elias felt a flicker of satisfaction. So, the general had come down to finish this personally. Zaltoric's golden eyes locked onto him. He raised a massive blade, its edge crackling with energy. You should have surrendered. Elias smirked. Not really my style. They clashed. Elias moved fast. Zaltoric's blade sliced through the air where he had stood a second before, the energy crackling as it sheared through a metal barricade like paper. The Zorsk general was fast for his size, his strikes precise, his footwork calculated. He wasn't just a commander, he was a warrior. Elias fired mid-roll, sending 3 shots toward the alien's chest. The general deflected them with a flick of his blade, the rounds sizzling as they ricocheted off his energy field. He lunged forward, his weapon sweeping in a horizontal arc. Elias barely ducked in time. The heat of the blade seared the air above him. He fired again, aiming for the exposed joint between armor plates. One shot hit, burning through the outer layer, but Zaltoric barely flinched. "You are skilled," the general admitted, voice calm despite the battle raging around them. "But skill will not save you." Elias grinned, stepping back to gain distance. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." Zaltoric surged forward, using his weight to press the attack. Elias sidestepped, feeling the ground tremble beneath the force of the strike. He knew he couldn't overpower the alien in a direct fight. He had to be faster. Smarter. He dropped a flash charge and turned away as the bright explosion filled the area. Zaltoric snarled, momentarily blinded. Elias used the opening, aiming for the weak spot he had already hit. 3 more rounds struck home. The general staggered, golden eyes narrowing in pain. But he did not fall. Elias exhaled sharply. "Damn. You're tough." Zaltoric's mandibles twitched in what could have been a grim smile. "Humans rely on tricks. Deception. You do not fight with honor." Elias scoffed. "Honor doesn't win wars. Winning wins wars." Zaltoric lunged again, but this time, Elias was ready. Instead of dodging, he stepped forward, inside the general's guard. The movement caught Zaltoric off balance for a fraction of a second, just long enough. Elias jammed the barrel of his sidearm against the alien's exposed side and pulled the trigger. The blast tore through armor and flesh. Zaltoric let out a guttural roar, staggering back. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed a combat knife from his belt and drove it into the wound, twisting hard. The Zorsk general collapsed to one knee, breathing ragged. Elias took a step back, guns still trained on him. "This war is over." Zaltoric looked up at him, pain evident in his gaze. But there was no fear. Only understanding. "You fight, as I would," the general admitted. "With purpose." Elias nodded. "Then you understand why you need to call them off." Zaltoric exhaled, shoulders lowering. He tapped a control on his gauntlet. The battlefield shifted as the Zorsk forces hesitated. A recall signal. Elias watched as the remaining Dominion soldiers pulled back, retreating toward their ships. The battle was won. Zaltoric met his gaze one last time. "You were never the prey, were you?" Elias shook his head. "No." The general let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "I warned them." And then, without another word, he rose and walked away, vanishing into the retreating ranks. Elias let him go. Some victories didn't need to be finished with a bullet.